Very pleased to introduce one of my colleagues who's going to chair the future of Latin America, Enrique Garland. Enrique has been an outstanding member of our team, and he is from Latin America, and he's going to chair the next session. If you could welcome Enrique Garland to the stage.
Thank you very much, Julie. Well, this panel appears to be the kind of odd one out because it's not focusing on a particular vertical. But the beauty of this technological revolution is that it leverages on human capital. And human capital is not a constrained resource in principle. Therefore, it has the power to enable not only a single industry, but a whole continent. So in order to introduce how human capital can enable Latin America in the context of the digital revolution, I'm going to give a brief overview of Latin America this day. First of all, if there is, in order to put it into context, if there is a golden rule in understanding the future, is that the past is made out of contingencies. And historians who are brave enough to walk beyond the boundaries of their profession and take a view of the future tend to be much more accurate in predicting than economists relying on their scientific toolkit. This applies to the case of the recent financial meltdown, and is no different when we're trying to have a view on Latin America, which has been shaken by a lot of populist governments, and there is a natural resource course as well. Therefore, my kind of recommendation for the next, before hearing the next two speakers, is that for sure reading 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez is more powerful than more powerful for understanding business in Latin America than reading Jim O'Neill's latest report, possibly, on the continent. So I therefore beg you to walk away from this whole emerging market as an asset class label and really engage with the more historical and view from experiences kind of perspective. For, our first speaker, now it's very sexy to hear about the Rocket Internet model. Jose actually is the pioneer of this now a scalable model which is scaling completely. And he founded the Remate.com in 1999 and partially cashed out to Terra, which was a business owned by Telefonica back in the day, and then floated the company in NASDAQ. He currently founds two businesses per year in Latin America and builds them from the ground up. So what we're going to have is linking to my historical perspective kind of approach. He's going to give us his experiences and insights on building truly game-changing businesses in Latin America. So please, Jose.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone, and thank you, for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. Julie, thanks for the invitation. So, what I'm going to try to do is just very quickly to give you a flavor of some of the key learnings that I've had by operating and building businesses in Latin America. And then from there, I'll give you my perspective of what are some of the important things that I think will be happening in the next years, that I think will basically forge the future. And please understand that my perspective is purely from the internet technology side of things, so I'm going to try to make that from that point of view. So very quickly, Latin America is big. We have 600 million people. Most of the market, people speak Spanish. Only Brazil, people don't speak Spanish. But at the end, it's a region that can be approached. It should be approached very differently. But if you approach the whole region, you can really address a very sizable market. Clearly, Brazil is massive. It's half of the Latin American market is Brazil. So if you want to go to Latin America, thinking about Brazil, it's always a very, very important priority, and thinking about how make your business work in Brazil as you go to other markets, it's key. if you are able to win Brazil, you will win half of Latin America. Even though it's not the Spanish-speaking Latin America, you will still win half of Latin America. Now, a couple of very important things on the trends. I mean, Latin America has been growing their GDP per capita over the course of the last 10, 15 years. No? And that's a very good news for people that want to address consumption, because that means that the middle class has been becoming bigger and bigger. And this is more of a reality in Brazil. And when you have a 200 million people market like Brazil, where you have a upcoming middle class, there is a lot of opportunities that you can basically think of how to provide them with new things. Also, a very positive thing, and again, there's never enough of this, but it seems that the poor people, and the poor index is dropping. So more and more, hopefully, in the future, we'll be able to have less poor people and more of a strong middle class. And there is some clear progress. As I said, there's never enough on that. So that's kind of the context of the region. E-commerce and the internet are clearly growing. So as you can see, the market only on Brazil today of e-commerce is already 27 billion. No? And I think even though it's slowing down on growth, it's already sizable. And the penetration is still way lower than what you have in other markets like the US or developed markets, but it's also increasing. No? We are talking already of something around 40% in Brazil, and with expectations of growing more and more. So now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what are some of the things that have happened to me in my experience. I think that when you build companies in the region, you need to think very much about business model risk and market risk. So in my mind, I generally try to avoid taking both. So if I'm going to go to a market that is risky like Mexico or Brazil or Argentina, I much rather go with a concept that already exists and just basically customize that concept and execute well. No? Here are some clear examples of that. The US, comparables of eBay, Expedia, Amazon, or Craigslist, you clearly have, comparables in the region of companies that have done very similar themes with very big success. And what I want to stress here is Latin America is very different. Not because you go to Mexico means that you will succeed in Peru or you will succeed in Colombia. You need to be aware that we speak the same language, but there is still a very interesting differences between some of the countries. And if you want to succeed and you want to customize, you need to be very sensitive to those differences and try to adapt into the culture. No? And people sometimes say, you are copying business. I mean, I don't think so, because we are not just taking the code of a company and just replicating that. I mean, we are doing a lot of very thorough work in terms of making sure that whatever we offer in the local market is customized. And this experience could be as challenging as coming up with a new idea, I would say. So one of the things that you generally see in Latin America is that if you are successful, growth comes very fast. And it generally passes a tag, and you need to be aware that there's going to be very big operational complexity. I mean, operating in emerging markets is not necessarily as simple and easy as it is in the US. There's a lot of bureaucracy. When you think about the tax regime and the tax system, and the time that it takes you to get things done is significantly different, and you need to plan for that. You need to be very careful on not overspending. I mean, we've made a lot of mistakes when we built the Remate, which was the first company that I built. I mean, we ended up having to spend much more than hopefully what I would spend now on building projects because of the lack of experience. No? So my advice is be very careful. And lastly, capital needs are incredibly important. When you are building a business in Latin America, there is a massive lack of capital. So you can find at this stage, there's much more, in interest of early stage investors to go and put the first $1 million, $1.5 million, whatever. But the people that would come and give you $5, $10 million to basically bring the business to the next level and be able to raise, growth capital, it's still very, very limited. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that a lot of companies are facing right now in our space. They are going through what is called the Series A, Series B crunch. And here you can see, I mean, things like being very disciplined at the beginning, being well prepared, and being very conscious about the Series A crunch. Think about your financing strategy since the beginning, so that you can basically try to mitigate a little bit the potential effects and drawbacks that you can have for not having enough capital available. And that's a challenge. That's something that the governments need to work on and fight on, because up to the point that businesses cannot finance themselves after the seed, you'll never be able to, to breach the whole value chain. No? Now, something that we've seen more and more, building a startup is way easier and cheaper than it was 10 years ago. When I started my first business, just for infrastructure to be able to have a business live, I had to spend about 1.5 million. That same thing that I did at that point with 1.5 million, I could do today with 10,000. So, the message here is there is much more easiness from the technology point of view and availability for people to be able to launch new things. You don't require so much capital. You just require people that are well educated, very well driven, and that want to get things done. And when we invest, we normally don't like to invest in people that cannot show us something live, because we believe that at this stage, at this time, is much easier. And that's a clear trend that is going to help Latin America the same way that it's helping other places in the world. Now, also, be sure that when you go and do business there, get well informed. I mean, don't get involved in things that you are not very passionate about, and try to avoid the problems of not being focused. No? Some of the things that we've seen as we build companies, we think that there is a general tendency of trying to do everything yourselves. I think that when you try to target the region, you need to understand that you need to have diversity. Even though we are similar, as I said before, you need to try to customize to be local, and try to build that diversity into your teams. Don't do it by yourself, and just basically make sure that you can build some of the best teams around. No? One of the big things that we generally see is that you can think that you want to go from point A to point B, and you might think that you'll go straight, but at the end you need to have the capacity of readapting, and reinventing and rechanging yourself as you go through the experience of building something. No? Clearly, we always say, let's go after big markets. It's easier to, it's the same, generally it is the same to make a business work in a small market than a big market. And there's a lot of controversy there. People that say, well, is it better to be the head of the mouse or the tail of the lion? No? And I think that it depends. It depends on the category. But generally, our view is we like to go for big markets, and we like to be in a position where we can be the winners. No? And not always is easy, but if we can, we prefer and much rather have that. Have always a strong focus in your customers. That's always very important and pays back. Listen to what your customers have to say, especially if you have people from different parts of Latin America. You cannot address a customer from Mexico the same way that you do a customer of Colombia or from Argentina. So listen to your customers. And when you're ready to launch your business, don't think to wait until you have the perfect product. At the same time, don't launch something that doesn't have the basic functionalities. No? In Latin America especially, if you have the opportunity to raise more, always raise more, because you will always need it later. As I said before, raising capital can be very cyclical, and sometimes you have the window of opportunity that is open. It has happened in Brazil. Brazil was very hot, money was flowing. Today, companies are really having a very hard time in raising follow-on capital. So when you can, raise capital, and be very cautious in terms of how much you spend, and not because you've been able to access $5, $6, $7 million, think that that it's going to remain like that. No? These are just some very quick learnings of a couple of friends, of people that have built businesses in Latin America and so on. So I think adapt to local markets. Don't try to do so many things. Focus on the things that matter. And be very conscious that it normally takes way longer to scale businesses than what you think. Latin America, when I started my first business, I did my first year business plan, I did it on year 4. No? So clearly, you need to be aware that when you go do business in Latin America, think long term, be ready to go through a lot of those instabilities and cycles, and think that you are there to stay. And if you are thinking with a long-term view and are ready and prepared to go through all those cycles, you'll succeed. If you go there and you play opportunistically, I mean, you might be lucky and you might succeed, but there might be a lot of other situations or circumstances where you won't. No? Well, growth is important. Think about profitability. Relationships are very important in the region. No? Make sure that you build out your network, that you connect with the right people, that you access the right businessman. Unfortunately, Latin America is very consolidated, and a lot of the big families control big chunks of the different economies of different countries. So if you want to have an in into those, you need to build those relationships. And a lot of times you are going to be disruptive to them, but at the same time, make sure that you try to build those relationships. No? Again, as I said before, read the future, see what has happened somewhere else, see what happened in India, see what happened in the US, see what happened in China, and try to make some conclusions out of that. In this case, this shows very clearly the power of networks. What happens, this is a study that was made by Endeavor, and basically what it shows is that a very large percentage of the later stage startups tend to be very much related to a very consolidated group of companies. This is the case of PayPal. Look how many companies came out just of the people that created PayPal, which was one of the pioneers in the space. Same situation, you can see this is Latin America, and you see that there is 4 or 5 companies. Mercado Libre is a company that acquired us, and you can see that basically all the companies are interconnected. So being able to play the network effect to this, can really make a very big difference in terms of how you execute and operate. These are just some of the players that operate in the region. Unfortunately, there are not many. There are not as many as we would like. I mean, if there is problems in Europe to have, investors, Latin America is even harder. No? You do have some people, but it's not many. So just to wrap it up, each market has its own nuances, as I mentioned before. Proven models allow us to focus on execution. Tropicalization is key. Build your local execution capacity, and be very much aware about taxes, tariffs, market conditions, etc. When you go into the region, make sure that you avoid procyclicality, as I was saying. Don't go in there to try to take advantage of the rush, and go in and go fast out. Make sure that you go in and you think long term. Prepare yourself to go through a very unstable environment. You'll be up, and then the next month you'll be down, and then again in a year you'll be up again, so prepare for that. Be bold. I mean, when you go to Latin America, you need to make sure that when everybody gets scared, you don't, and make sure that you sustain and you remain and you think long term. See what's happening in other regions, and also make sure that you choose the right partners. No? So how do I see it moving forward? The tech ecosystem is maturing, so I think we're going to see more and more companies, going public in the region, which is good. I mean, there is sizable businesses that are being built that are considered to, in the process of going public. As of now, the only e-commerce company that trades in Nasdaq is Mercado Libre, which was a company that acquired us. But there is a number of others that are already sizable, and I think in the next 4 or 5 years, you are going to see a very strong impact and change on that. No? I don't think that, unfortunately, there's going to be massive innovation, and from the investment point of view, it's great to see that companies in Latin America innovate, but obviously when you compete, with countries like the US or the UK, where you get a much higher percentage of GDP, and you have private schools that are really investing a lot into research and development, it's very hard to compete. No? So if I would have to put my bet in something, I would not put it in that. Make sure that you build the right structures to attract the right talent. And as I said, there's going to be much more affluency because of the drop of costs in technology, in people being able to build new things. Infrastructure continues to improve. Payments and logistics are still one of the very big challenges for marketplaces and for e-commerce in the region. There is a lot of initiatives, but I can tell you, when you compare Mexico with Brazil, Mexico has 110 million people, Brazil has 200 million people, and the e-commerce market of Brazil is about 7 times the one in Mexico. And there's a reason for that. The payments methods in Mexico are still not working as well as the ones in Brazil, which are clearly not working as well as the ones in the US or potentially in other places in Europe. No? So then governments should do more. They are doing more. That doesn't mean that they are always doing the right things, but being able to engage, the public sector to support the entrepreneurial side, I think, is very important. Be aware of the Series A crunch. We hope that one day we're going to be able to have enough investors, that will help those companies go from zero to growth capital. Build your relationships, and basically, keep close to investors and entrepreneurs and build a network. So that's basically it, and I hope that this gave you a little bit of a flavor of how things are done in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jose, on sharing your insights on how it is to invest outside California and more in what global venture capital could look like in the future, which is something we believe in Ariadne, which is betting on disruptive ecosystems rather than on disruptive technology per se. So the next speaker, he's a historian by formation. He read history at Cambridge, then became a journalist and has lawyer experience, and is now today focused on the publishing business. He's a managing director at Constable and has just published a book before the World Cup called Golazo, which means in English, such a goal, or what's a goal. And basically, I think something that glues Latin America is football. And there is an Uruguayan intellectual who said that you could recognize where someone in Latin America comes from the way he plays football. So having said that, I would like to introduce Andreas Campomar.
Thank you. I'm afraid there's going to be no PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to go straight in. I'm a publisher by trade. I specialize in non-fiction and literary fiction. I published Julie's book, the wonderful Welcome to Entrepreneur Country, a few years ago, which I think is an absolutely groundbreaking book. But in June, July, I took a sabbatical and I went around Brazil writing for the New York Times and writing essays on not just Brazil, but on Latin America. And there was something that I came across when I was watching that infamous game, Germany versus Brazil. I don't know how many of you watched it, but do you remember in the 23rd minute, Germany had scored a goal, and we expected Brazil to bounce back, but then you had goals in quick succession, 23rd minute, 24th minute, 26th minute, 29th minute. And then I realized that actually the country was beginning to disintegrate. And I saw something that epitomized, and I'm Uruguayan, a certain Latin Americanness. There is a kind of lack of belief. And I don't know if you remember that panic in their eyes, the realization on the world stage that they had failed. Latin Americans are always obsessed by how they're viewed abroad. So, it is this kind of continent of extremes. On the one hand, you have Carlos Slim, who is the richest man in the world. 1 year here he is, next year he's number second. But yet, on the other hand, you have this inherent disbelief in the kind of potential of the continent. Eduardo Galeano, who's famous left-wing polemicist, was once talking to the Uruguayan writer Juan Carlos Onetti. And Onetti said to him, "Look, kid, if Beethoven had been born in Tacuarembó, which is a small town in northern Uruguay, he would only have made it to be conductor of the local village band." The problem is that geographical proximity to the United States has not really helped. We've received no respect from the States, over the centuries. In 1971, Richard Nixon advised the young Donald Rumsfeld, Latin America doesn't matter. People don't give one damn about Latin America now. In the same year, Galeano wrote his polemic, The Open Veins of Latin America, which he's since refuted, saying actually he shouldn't have written the book because actually he knew nothing about economics or anything else for that matter. But in it there was quite a very interesting and rather prescient chapter, and the chapter was entitled, The Goddess Technology Doesn't Speak Spanish. And that has been one of the overriding problems for Latin America in a world dominated by Apple, Sony, Microsoft, Amazon, and I can go on. So what we're looking at is a continent which is basically, there's the history of failure, or rather failed opportunity. In the 19th century, British-American attitudes differed little to that of Spain. The idea of El Dorado remained, although it now spoke a different language. Independence came in the 1810s and 1820s. By the early 1820s, Latin American governments started to float bonds in London. We know this is going to be an absolute fiasco. So Gran Colombia was the first republic, followed by Chile, Peru. And there was such an appetite for this investment that a Scottish adventurer issued a bond from a fictional republic called Boais. Anyway, the bubble eventually burst. And of course, the defaults came in quick succession. Peru, Gran Colombia, Chile, Mexico, Argentina, etc. This was a kind of primer in financial mismanagement that, in a sense, would set the tone for the next 2 centuries. But yet, by the end of the 19th century, despite the inherent trading risk, investors started to kind of flock back to the region. Now, the products in Latin America vary from country to country, and at that time, Argentina and Uruguay, the River Plate, produced meat, wool, and hides. Nitrates and guano were exported from Peru, coffee, sugar, rubber from Brazil, copper and nitrates from Chile, and then in the early 20th century, oil from Venezuela. I mean, fortunes in the region were made as quickly as they were lost. And yet, throughout the 20th century, there was this cyclical thing of kind of boom and bust. But by the early 21st century, Latin America started to withstand kind of global crisis. Mexico, for instance, didn't suffer nearly as much as it might have done because of its hedging strategy. Brazil held up because of its government credit rating that reached institutional level quality. Trade relationships became diversified that not only included the US, but also included China. It was essentially an export and kind of import economy. But the fundamental problem with Latin America always has been is its lack of ideas. If we have a look at the US, 254 Nobel laureates. Let's have a look at the figures for Latin America. Central America, 6. South America, 10. So, and this is a region that is kind of 8% of the global population. So when it comes to entrepreneurship, the region has a very kind of poor record. Countries of the OECD spend an average of 2.4% of GDP on research and development. If we have a look at the 2 member states of that club, Chile and Mexico, the figure is 0.4. Other countries in the region are even less. In 2010, the world's application for patent registration filed from the region was 2.6%. But yet, at the same time, entrepreneurship lies in the kind of blood of Latin Americans, because in a continent with polarities of rich and poor, necessity remains the mother of invention. Statist and populist governments have not furthered entrepreneurism. For many middle classes, security has come in the form of working for a multinational, i.e. a foreign enterprise. Institutions have always been weak. Countries tend to be unreliable. That's why they're so interested in soccer in many ways, which is fundamental to the region, because at least your football team won't let you down. But yet, if we look at entrepreneurship, it is a kind of small trader mentality, the small business, the garage owner, the food stall owner. Tech boom has come to the region late. Even a few years ago, few knew what a startup was. And many have failed to come to grips with concepts that have been ubiquitous in Silicon Valley for years now. Earlier this year, Andres Oppenheimer, who's a very good Argentine journalist and columnist for the Miami Herald, looked at internet readiness ranking of 148 countries around the world. And of course, there were no surprises who were at the top: Finland, Singapore, Sweden, Netherlands, etc. But yet, when we have a look at the Latin American countries, the first Latin American country on the list is Chile at number 35. Brazil is number 69. Mexico is number 79. And what is rather troubling is that Brazil has fallen somehow 9 places in the ranking. Mexico fell 16 places. These countries being displaced by other economies coming to the fore. Also, what we must remember that the index measured 54 variables, including internet infrastructure, education skills, and also how to use information technology. there is an idea in Latin America that still obtains, and I think this is a cultural thing, that the internet is still used for communication rather than enterprise. And I think this is kind of fundamental. But yet there are exceptional countries in the region, Chile, for instance, whose idea of exceptionalism goes back to the early 19th century of kind of democratic reform, has taken the bold step, because the thing is, in the region, a lot of governments feel pressurized that before addressing the kind of tech boom, they should, moreover, address educational reform, healthcare, poverty. But Chile took a bold step a few years ago and had this idea of Startup Chile, in which they enticed entrepreneurs, budding entrepreneurs, to come to Chile. In 2010, there were 22 startups from 14 countries, and they were provided by $40,000 of equity-free seed capital and a temporary one-year visa in order to develop these projects. The admissions process was approved and conducted by Silicon Valley experts. And what these experts were, in a sense, trying to do was make these Latin Americans think differently. That Chile needs to think of itself more like Norway, Israel, or Singapore, rather than just another Latin American country, albeit exceptional. So, in a sense, what does Latin America need to do? Well, it needs to remove the bureaucracy to set up business. It is particularly slow, or has been very slow in doing this. It needs decent regulation, investment in research and development. Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru are going to raise their spending on R&D to 1% of GDP by 2015. Even that's not good enough. The creation of ecosystems, i.e. wider networks, and not the reliance on rather narrow ones, which Latin Americans can be. A bilingual culture, and this is kind of fundamental, the lack of people speaking English in the region. And also to change the culture of Latin Americans. And I think this is fundamental to the region, to understanding the region, and why Latin America has lagged behind. We have a Hispanic heritage, and whilst admirable, this Spanish heritage, in a sense, rejected modernism, empiricism, rationalism, and in a sense, capitalist economic development. For many, the failure of Latin America has also been the failure of the Catholic Church in that region. Catholicism, and also as a Catholic myself, the idea that, image is everything, versus Protestantism, which is the use of the social contract, which is fundamental. And also, the other thing we suffer from is the dependency theory. We are poor because they are rich. And this lack of self-esteem and being cut off from the rest of the world has not done us any favors. In 2010, the Brazilian foreign minister, when he was addressing the International Labour Organization, said, "We still have a colonial mentality, and if we don't break those mental barriers, we'll never advance." And I think this comes back to what I was saying before. It is education that will change the region. And I think through technology and entrepreneurship, that change can be affected. I think it's fundamental that the region really does think differently about who it is. And the thing about Latin Americans is always that they have this obsession with the past rather than the future. And I think that in the coming years, what we'll see is a new generation of young Latin Americans who think very differently from their parents, very differently from their grandparents, have gotten rid of this shackled Hispanic culture, and will really change the tenor of the region. Because there is a great ignorance about the region out there. The US have never really understood us. Western Europe have always been more interested in the exoticism of Africa and the Far East. And I think in the coming years, Latin America will really come to the fore. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I thought it was really insightful, although it was quite a strong reality check. Now I would like to invite both of the panelists to receive questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Felipe. I'm Portuguese, so obviously I follow what's going on in South America very closely and with great interest. And so I have to be careful here how I express myself. But I follow the developments in Latin America with a great deal of worry, and I see things getting from bad to worse. I mean, not really necessarily in countries like Chile, obviously, which is the great superstar in Latin America, and Colombia more and more, and Mexico, but especially what's happening in Brazil, in Argentina, in Venezuela. We say in Portugal that, you know, Brazil is turning into Argentina, Argentina into Venezuela, Venezuela, Cuba, and Cuba will be a democracy. So, yeah, so, I mean, and obviously because you have all these leaders which are ruling their countries with a great deal of corruption, the wealth of the country concentrated in a few. This problem of mentality that you mentioned, I think, is the main issue there. The problem of the education. So my question is, how do you see the political developments in the future? And do you believe that this kind of dictatorial rule in those main countries that, you know, define the future of Latin America will evolve into? I mean, whoever
Please.
can. Yeah.
This idea of the caudillo, the leader, as it were, has been prevalent in Latin American society for 2 centuries, and it's basically a Hispanic, it's an Iberian concept. The thing is, with democratization and kind of drilling down, I think what you'll have is you'll have change. But the thing is, the main problem in Latin America as it stands at the moment, because I touched on this, is that you have countries that are essentially run by elites. And the thing is, if you have a look at most of the not all the presidents, but most of the presidents and the ruling classes, they have nothing to do with the people down at the bottom. They look differently, they speak differently. Moreover, they were educated abroad. Now, what needs to happen is that it needs to be kind of grassroots, and by no means, you know, am I a Chavist, or, you know, do I agree with Gani Morales? But the idea being that there needs to be some kind of ground level indigenous feel to it. And I think that will only come through education and educating the masses. Because otherwise it's going to, you'll see the same thing, and I've seen it in Argentina for the last, 40 years. This kind of revolution and then bust, revolution and bust. And people always say, oh yes, well this president will do something, this minister, I mean, you have the same thing in Mexico. Yes, this one's quite clever, he will do something. And of course, you're in the same situation again.
The problem that you have in a lot of these countries is that there is an entrenched, network, and it's very hard to create change because there are so many interests that follow all of the people that just to come in and renew and basically clean it up is very hard. It has to be a longer-term view, and I think that from the government perspective, there has to be, important changes. There has to be more focus on education. I cannot agree more. I think that's the only way to get out of this problem. I don't support at all the views of what is happening in Venezuela, and that's clearly making, in my humble opinion, very big damage, to the whole region. I think that Argentina is taking a second very strong lead into that. And I really believe that as you continue to educate the people, they won't be able to be manipulated as much as they are manipulated today. It's very sad, but I can give you examples in Mexico where, before votes, people just basically call up the masses and give away lunch boxes, and they get votes. And I'm sorry to say that, but that's very sad. And the reason why that happens is because, unfortunately, a lot of these people have had no chance, of being educated or have very little exposure, unless you continue to increase or decrease the level of poverty, as I showed in my plots, increase, the level and access to education, it's going to be very hard to do that. And then at the same time, you need to have someone that is very bold and is willing to break out with the legacies.
Julie.
In my book, as Andreas knows, but I wrote a chapter which is The World is Becoming Feminine. And the reason why that's important is because if Latin America is dominated by elites, and men are very hierarchically driven, thank God women aren't. And so I guess the question is the world becoming feminine in Latin America?
I mean, to be very honest, much less than anywhere else, and that's really a pity, because I think that the type of opportunities that women see in some of these environments are still very limited, and I think it is much better than in other parts of the world, but it is also much worse than in other parts of the world. And I think you can just see that very simply. I mean, when I was at the GSB, in Stanford, the people from the MBA from Latin America, I mean, maybe we were 30 or 40 people, out of which there was one woman. So, now it's changing. Now when you do that mix, there is much more. But clearly, there needs to be empowerment and there needs to be, support and women need to start getting a little bit more of, of credibility and access in a lot of the organizations. Think about some of the big companies. It's very rare to see a woman that has been allowed, to get into the top of a lot of these businesses. It's changing. If you look to some of the presidents in the region, you do have some women. So there is progress being made, but I still think that it's a very big challenge and clearly nothing compared to what you see in other geographies like Europe or the US.
I agree. The interesting thing is that it should be completely different, because the thing is these societies tend to be matriarchal. Mm-hmm. And there is, within the family, there is empowerment for women there. But what happens is there is kind of no conversion onto the business scene. So I think that kind of more so than a lot of other societies, and probably even kind of greater than Northern European societies or even the United States, the conversion should be quite easy because the power is already there. But it's only at home, it's only in the kind of family that it happens. So I can see, in the future that leap is made once Latin American men start to understand that what can happen at home can also happen in a business sense.
I have one final question. In contrast to kind of the bad part of the history in Latin America and shifting more towards the bright side, we've seen there are some miracles inside Latin America, like Chile, like Peru, and like Colombia, which have engaged with the Washington Consensus, have followed very macroprudential policies, and have engaged with very export-oriented economies, and have technocrats running public policy. And that's why there has been an improvement from the early 90s to today. And shifting from where we are in terms of education, as Oppenheimer says, we're very, very much lagging, but shifting more towards the entrepreneur who views the future and wants to change the world. Is education really important for the entrepreneur, or is it more important to have the right incentives, financial market development, for example? So my question is, how important is it for financial markets to develop in order to have a venture capital industry?
I don't think that the main thing is the financial sector. I think that what matters a lot in our space is to have success stories. I showed the network effect before, no? And you realize that when you start to have different models of success, everything becomes interlinked. So a lot of the people that have been successful in building the internet community in the region will start, to give back, and they will be much more comfortable investing back their money into some of these businesses. It is very complicated to get real estate people to believe in the internet or to believe in technology just because it's a different business. People think differently. So I think that is a very important turning point, to make sure that there is several success cases. As I mentioned before, I think there is several very interesting companies in the region that are on track, to do very, very well. I think that's going to make a lot of people, succeed, not only economically, but also from the point of view of building something that makes a difference. And I think that all these people are going to be giving back, and then that network effect becomes very powerful from the point of view of investment, from the point of view of influence with the government, and also from the point of view of mentoring.
Well, yeah.
And I agree completely. I mean, I think one of the things with education is that, let's face it, they are entrepreneurial societies, but on a very, very small scale, on a very basic scale. And it's out of necessity more than anything else. What education will do is it will form some kind of structure. And I think that's what Latin Americans need, is that kind of structure that they haven't had, a certain rigor that needs to be applied. Because we've seen it, kind of economically and fiscally. And I remember years ago interviewing one ex-minister of finance who said, you know what it's like? You win the election, you go into the central bank, it's a mess, 2 years to try and clean it up, and then you're fighting the next election. So I think the thing is that government will just carry on its course. And I think that, in a sense, it's not really important so long as it gives entrepreneurs some kind of structure. The thing it needs to do is it needs to come from the ground up. And what has happened in a lot of these republics is that they've sought to create something from the top down. They've sought to create industries rather than taking a much more long-term approach, because they're quite short-termist in nature, is actually do it from the ground up and do it that way.
Okay, thank you very much, Jose and Andreas.
Thank you.